Good evening. Are you ready to start? I guess it's the time to start already. And I'd like to welcome everyone, and let me introduce myself first. My name is Dorota Kołodziejczyk, and I'm chair of Olga Tokarczuk Ex-centrum, a research center founded by our local Nobel Prize winner in literature for 2018, Olga Tokarczuk, and the Faculty of Letters at the University of Wrocław. It is my great honor to host our today's webinar by Professor Paula Slovica and Professor Scotta Slovica. Their joint talk will make us see, I'm sure, how disciplines cross their boundaries and share resources so that they can examine together the most urgent questions of today. And such projects crossing disciplinary and epistemological boundaries are at the heart of the Olga Tokarczuk Ex-Center research agenda. The event today is a joint initiative of Olga Tokarczuk Ex-Center, of the University of Wrocław and Academia Europaea Wrocław Knowledge Hub. It launches our joint project titled The Anthropocene, From Boundaries to Bonds, Interdisciplinary Crossovers in Knowledge Development. We're going to kick off the project on December the 8th and continue with the conference next October. I would now like to invite Professor Arkadiusz Wójs, Rector of Wrocław University of Science and Technology and Director of Academia Europaea Wrocław Knowledge Hub, to also welcome you to this event. Professor Wójs, I'm giving the floor to you. Hello.
Thanks, thank you, Dorota. Indeed, I'm very happy and privileged to welcome all the participants, our esteemed professors, Professor Paula Slovica and Professor Scotta Slovica, and all participants watching to this webinar that's, judging by the abstract and by the eminence of the speakers, is looking really exciting, looking great. And I'm doing this on behalf of Wrocław Knowledge Hub of Academia Europaea and Wrocław University of Science and Technology. So thank you for the privilege.
Professor Wójs, and now I would like to introduce Professor Wojciech Małecki, who will be our moderator for today. Professor Małecki shares a lot of research interests with our speakers, and I think especially in this field of experimental research within humanities. Yeah, and so I think I'm going to introduce also very interesting comments on the way. Okay, so Wojtek, if you can introduce our speakers, but before I give the floor to you, I would also like to thank our partners who helped us immensely in preparing this event today, which are the Olga Tokarczuk Foundation, the University of Wrocław, and also great thanks to the communications section of the University of Wrocław. Of course, the Faculty of Letters, and a great friend, the Wrocław University of Science and Technology. Wojtek, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dorota. It gives me great pleasure to be able to chair this session and to introduce our speakers for tonight, Professors Paula and Scotta Slovica. So, Professor Paula Slovica is Professor of Psychology at the University of Oregon and the president of Decision Research Institute. And I guess I can say without any exaggeration that he is one of the most influential contemporary social psychologists. Our guests are going to talk a lot about large numbers tonight, so I think it will not be inappropriate to mention that Professor Paula Slovica's work has been cited, at least according to Google Scholar, 188,000 times. For those of you who are academics, you know what that means. And for those of you who are not academics, this means that there's only a handful of people in the world in your field. When you're cited that many times, that there's only a handful of people in the world who are as influential as you are. And Professor Slovic's work owes that impact to the fact that he made fundamental contributions to our understanding of all kinds of biases, heuristics, and mechanisms that pertain to our decision processes, to our perception of risk, to pro-social behavior, and to compassion. And I'm not going to get into the details of all the fascinating and important discoveries he has made, as he's going to talk about many of those tonight. Let me just say that for his work on human decision processes, decision making, he just this year he received the prestigious Bauer Prize from the Franklin Institute. Now, Professor Scotta Slovica is professor, professor of environmental humanities at the University of Idaho, and also a key figure in the environmental humanities today. His work focuses on the relationships between, broadly speaking, culture and the environment, on how the environment is represented in culture and all kinds of cultural texts, literature most importantly, and how culture influences our attitudes and behavior toward the environment. Perhaps a good measure of how influential he is within the environmental humanities is the fact that he was the founding president of perhaps the most important organization, academic organization within the environmental humanities, that is ASLI, Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. And for years he had been the chief editor of that organization's flagship journal, ISLE, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and the Environment, published by Oxford University Press. And the approaches represented by our guests and their expertise is going to be combined in this lecture, as they are going to be talking about both the psychological and cultural aspects of our attitudes and toward all kinds of global problems, including environmental problems. And before I pass it over to Professor Scotta and Paula Slovica, Professor Scotta and Paula Slovica, I just wanted to briefly say that the lecture is going to last for around an hour. Then we're going to have roughly 20 minutes for the discussion. And please type your questions using the Q&A toggle in Zoom, or pytania i odpowiedzi for those of you using the Polish version of Zoom. And then we will ask as many of those questions. We're going to ask our guests as many of those questions as the time will allow. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Professor Paul Slovica, who will begin. Paul, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wojciech. And Scott and I wish to thank the organizers of this event for inviting us, and we hope that you'll find it of interest and importance. And it's always a pleasure for me to present together with my son Scott, who thought he was going into a different field from his father. I'm a psychologist, as was mentioned. He's a literary scholar, and he thought he was getting away from me, but our interests have merged over the years, as you'll see today. So I'll do the first part and lay out some problems that we're facing, and then I'll turn it over to Scott to perhaps see how we might solve those problems. That he'll get the tough part of this issue. So if we can start with my slides and and I'll present those slides. So let me just click on this and see if I can advance them. So you see my title. Well, this is the title of our combined talk. My part one is going to focus on the first part of our title. The more who die, the less we care. And some questions that I will address. What are the psychological, social, and political obstacles blocking effective decisions and actions on some of the world's urgent risk problems? And some of these include COVID-19 and more generally pandemic disease, climate change, genocide and mass atrocities, nuclear war, and partisan political violence, which is more of I'll just touch on lightly. I'm looking at that mostly within the American lens. And I should also mention that my perspective is mostly comes from research in the United States and Western countries. It's always important in an international context to appreciate the fact that there may be cultural and national differences in the way people respond to these issues. And that's something that we may want to discuss later, or that I would invite further research to look at, whether my story is how universal it is and how culturally specific it is. We have to be sensitive to that. Further questions, more recent vintages, refers to the issue of whether Vladimir Putin might resort to using chemical or nuclear weapons in Ukraine or elsewhere, and what should be done in light of this story that I'm about to present. And as I mentioned, then I'll turn that over to Scott to deal with the tough problems. So my path will be looking at some relevant psychological concepts and mechanisms to apply to these problems. And in particular, I'll focus on what Scott and I have called the deadly arithmetic of compassion. And it consists of three psychological mechanisms, which I'll describe in a bit of detail: psychic numbing, pseudo-inefficacy, a false sense of inefficacy, and what we call security prominence, or more generally, the prominence effect. I'll describe each of these in turn. And for theoretical foundation, I would refer you to this well-known book by psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, despite the fact that he's not an economist. And in 2011, he wrote this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, to describe the work that he and others have done over many decades on learning how how our minds work. I'm told this book has sold over 15 million copies, which is rather remarkable for a book which is sort of an academic textbook. And in this book, Professor Kahneman talks about two modes of thinking. When he refers to fast thinking, we also can call this the experiential way of thinking, or sometimes called System 1. And it's basically relying on our intuitions and the images and associations that flit through our mind very rapidly and create feelings in us, which we sometimes refer to with the term affect. It's really a jargon for feelings, positive and negative feelings about the information that we're experiencing. And it's very sensitive to stories and narratives, which convey feelings. And it's often non-conscious. We don't even realize we're thinking in this way. And this is in contrast to the slow way of thinking, which is analytical, and it's what we're taught to do in school. To be logical and deliberate, and to use reasons and symbols and numbers and mathematics, and we're very conscious when we're doing it, because we understand what we're trying to do, and often struggle to do it. And it also creates feelings in us, but usually the feelings come later after we've done the analysis, whereas in the fast system, feelings occur almost instantaneously to when information comes into our sphere of attention. So I'll be talking about both of these ways of thinking and how they how they cause problems for us in the face of large scale problems of facing the world. And what we have learned over the years is that, we mostly perceive risk not as a result of analysis. And we can do analysis and we should do analysis, but most of the time we react very quickly with an intuitive gut feeling in the fast thinking mode. And I have a book about the research on this called The Feeling of Risk. And by the way, Scott and I are happy to share our slides with anyone who's interested. We'll show a lot of slides. They're all available to anyone who's interested in it. So basically, fast thinking is what we would say is our default mode of thinking. It's because it's easy to do. It feels right. It usually works to get us through the day. We make a lot of decisions during our day, and we're not going around with a pencil, paper, calculator, analyzing the pros and the cons in some a deliberate way. We just sort of think, experience the feelings that we have when we think about making one decision or another, and rely on that. And so it usually works for us if our feelings have been educated by experience. But the problem is it is innumerate, and thus can lead to serious mistakes when the stakes of the problem are very very high. So fast thinking, I would argue, deceives us in the face of threats such as COVID-19, climate change, genocide, and nuclear war, and other major disasters, natural disasters. And also slow thinking can also fail us too. That's what I'll talk about, what we call the prominence effect. So this is where I'm going, and let's start with genocide and mass atrocities. So the problem here is that we are incoherent in how we value life, both human and non-human life. We value individual lives greatly, but those lives lose their value when they become part of a larger crisis. As a result, we do too little to protect life in the face of existential threats to humanity and to environment. After World War II and the Nazi atrocities and the Holocaust and elsewhere, we vowed that never again would we allow this kind of thing to take place. But unfortunately, that has not been the case. We really see that again and again, catastrophic episodes of killing are through genocide and other forms of mass atrocities are all too common. They create an immense toll of suffering and death, often with little notice or resistance from the outside world. So this slide was presented at a lecture I heard when we had a seminar a number of years ago in Auschwitz on genocide. And the presenter was a woman named Barbara Harf, a scholar of genocide. And this figure, which is not very readable, basically has a simple and disturbing story. The title is Genocides and Political Mass Murders from 1950 to 2003. And you see that there are dozens of instances around all over the world where large numbers of people were killed by their governments or by other agents of violence. So it happens quite often, and as we speak, there are countries around the world where mass killing is taking place. And obviously, Ukraine is in everyone's minds right now as one example of this. So it goes on and on. And so the overarching question is, why do we rarely intervene in mass murder, genocide, and other human and environmental catastrophes? And there's obviously no one simple answer to a question like this. There are many answers. I mean, it's clearly dangerous, costly, and difficult for some nation to go into another sovereign nation that's killing its citizens and intervene there. It's difficult in all these ways. There's issues of racism. Sometimes the people who are being abused are of a different race or culture, and that reduces our sense of empathy for them. And also, if it's taking place at a distance from us, that reduces the response. And there's issues of responsibility. Shouldn't many different nations all be working on this? Why should any one nation shoulder that burden of intervention? But my focus has been on the yellow highlighted psychological concepts, which are psychic numbing, and which is the fact that the information we get fails to convey the feelings and emotion that are needed to motivate us, to spark us, our motivation to act. Second problem is a false sense of inefficacy, that even when there are things we can do as individuals or nations, we may feel that we are not doing enough, and therefore we back away and don't do what we can do. Well, and also, lastly, there's a more complicated mechanism, which is the dominance of protecting certain prominent objectives, such as national security, over protecting foreign lives when decisions are made. This is the prominence effect. I'll talk a little bit about each of these next. So these are the three mechanisms I just mentioned, and they all contribute to this arithmetic of compassion and the shocking summary statement that in many cases, the more who die, the less we care. And so basically, when we're relying on our feelings, we're deceived because the feeling system doesn't count very well. Saving one life is huge. It's very important. But if there are two people at risk, sometimes the importance feels less than twice that of one, and sometimes even less than the importance we feel for one. I'll talk about some research that shows this. And this is basically saying that our feelings don't add very well. Multiplication is just a form of fast adding. So it's not surprising that our feelings don't multiply either. And this is illustrated in two related quotes by famous people. So Annie Dillard, a famous American writer, in 1999 was contemplating what was then the population of China. She said there are 1,198,500,000 people alive now in China. To get a feel for what this means, and I highlight the word "feel" and "means" because the meaning of information is to a large part driven by the feelings that information creates in us. So to get a feel for what this number means, just take yourself in all your singularity, importance, complexity, and love, and multiply by 1,198,500,000. And then she sort of stabs us with the conclusion, see nothing to it, where she's probably smiling because she knows that we can't do this really very well. We learn to read and write and add and subtract large numbers, but we're not taught to try to understand the reality beneath the surface of these numbers. And very interestingly, from a completely different direction, a Nobel Prize winning biologist who was concerned about nuclear war and the destruction of cities with nuclear weapons said, "I'm deeply moved if I see one man suffering and would risk my life for him. Then I talk impersonally about the possible pulverization of our big cities with 100 million dead. I am unable to multiply one man's suffering by 100 million." So he recognizes the failure of the multiplication of these feelings. And so this brings us to two important questions. How should we value the protection of human lives? And how do we value the protection of human lives? And why do the answers to these questions differ? And why does this matter? So here's two possible answers to the should question. We call these normative answers. One is if every life is intrinsically of equal importance or value, then as the number of lives at risk increase, the value of protecting them should increase in some linear fashion. We just add their value, and we might want to tweak this a little bit in the case where we're getting to the edge of say genocide or extinction of a species, where the next lives lost could lead to genocide, the destruction of a culture or people or a species, where those lives are even more important to protect than the ones that came before them. So the curve goes upward quite steeply. So these are two normative models. And then we ask, well, what do we know from science and also from just experience, history, about how we do value catastrophic threats? And we find that our actions in the face of these threats don't follow either of these normative models. That's because our feelings override our analytic judgments, our normative judgments, and these feelings tend to be insensitive to large losses of life. So here's what schematically two ways that we do value lives as the number of lives increases. So the first one, model on the left, is a model where the very first life is most important. You see the very steep increase in value, and then 2 is not twice as high as 1 in terms of valuing or importance. And then at some point it flattens out. And the model on the right is even more, well, the one on the left is disturbing because it means that life, which is so important, if it's the very first and only life that we're concerned about, is very valuable, but that life loses its value if it's part of a larger problem, a larger tragedy, where an additional life doesn't seem to mean anything different. And it's even worse than that in some cases. As the numbers increase, not only do we become insensitive, like the flattening of the curve on the left, but the concerns collapse. They fade or collapse and become even less as the numbers increase. I'll illustrate both of these very briefly. So we can do a kind of a thought experiment on this model on the left, the insensitivity. You think about how you might feel when you see or learn about a child who's starving, and you probably feel badly about that that situation. And supposing I was to say, well, there are 5 children starving, and you maybe see their pictures, you might feel a bit worse. And then I say, oh, wait a minute, it's really 6 children. I would propose that you won't feel any different thinking about 6 children than about 5 children. Just, your feelings won't do that. You can obviously, if you do the numbers, you know that 6 is 1 additional child more. So if you think about the numbers, you can appreciate it. But if you're relying on your feelings are insensitive. And so laboratory experiments can demonstrate numbing and compassion collapse, but we also can see that when we look outside our windows and see what's going on in the world. But here's an example very quickly of an experiment that shows this insensitivity. Here it was done right after the genocide that took place in Rwanda in 1994, where 800,000 people were murdered by the rival tribe in about 100 days, and the world stood by and did nothing to prevent that. And those who survived the genocide, the Tutsi population, fled to neighboring to what was then Chad, a neighboring country, and were put in refugee camps, large numbers of people in refugee camps. And they began to, they lacked clean water, and they began to contract and often die from cholera. So my colleagues and I were looking for a way to study this issue, the numbing, and we saw this clipping in the local paper that said that the people in the camps needed clean water, and there needed to be well drilling equipment sent to the camp and pumps that could provide clean water to keep people healthy. And so we created two scenarios around this, and one which said, well, basically we said that you're an official in a neighboring country, you'd like to help, and you have enough money to provide drilling and pumping equipment. They could provide water. They could keep 4,500 people in a camp healthy indefinitely. Would you do it? And you have other ways that you could spend your money. You could spend it internally by improving your schools or your hospitals and so forth. But would you instead send the money to the camp to keep 4,500 people healthy and hopefully alive? And the experiment was we varied the size of the camp. One group we told the camp has 250,000 people in it. You can keep 4,500 people alive, healthy. The other group we said the camp has 11,000 people. You can keep 4,500 people alive. And so, which camp do you think there was more support for sending the money? Your intuitions would probably be correct here. The participants were more willing to send clean water to save 4,500 lives in a refugee camp of 11,000 than to send water to save 4,500 lives in a large camp of 250,000. And this is very much in keeping with that function on the left of it that I showed you. Reducing 250,000 people at risk to 245,500 seems less of a difference than reducing from 11,000 to 6,500, even though it's the same number of lives. So we see that the number of lives is gauged not by the number, but by the proportion of lives, which is in keeping with the psychic numbing, that curve on the left that we see. But what about the collapse function on the right? There's experiments on that as well. And here's an experiment by Kogut and Ritov, two Israeli psychologists, a number of years ago, and they posed the question again to different groups of people. In one group, they said there's a child being treated for cancer, and their treatment costs about $300,000. Will you donate towards that, and how much? And the second group said there are 8 children being treated for cancer and the cost for all the 8 in total is $300,000. Would you donate, and how much? And this is what the donations looked like. There was a greater donation to a single individual than to a group of 8 people. So you see, it's not only greater, it's reduced. And the further research, so that my colleagues and I were very much interested by this first study, and we decided to do more research on it. And we said, well, what if there was only 2 people in need instead of 1? Would we still see that? And we found that indeed that was the case. So it relates to a question again by Annie Dillard, who the author who I mentioned earlier, who was asked the question that what number do other individuals blur for me? She was thinking about compassion fatigue. And so we did an experiment. We gave people the opportunity to donate to, in 3 cases of children who were facing starvation. In one case, we illustrated the problem with a single little girl named Rokia. A second group could donate to children like the little boy Musa. The third group could donate to children like, and we showed both pictures, Rokia and Musa. And we asked them how sympathetic or concerned are you to the plight of the children, and how much would you donate? And we found, well, I'm missing, the slide doesn't show the data. But what we found was that when there were 2 children, the feelings of concern and the donations were less than when there were a single child. So the answer to Annie Dillard's question from this experiment is that maybe individuals begin to blur and compassion begins to collapse, even as low as 2 people instead of 1. And we can think of that in terms of what we call empathy, the feeling, understanding how other people are feeling and seeing the world. And we say you can empathize with someone by putting yourself in another person's shoes. But what if there are 2 people? It so happens that after we did this study, there was an exhibit of Cuban art and sculpture in our local community. And there was a sculpture that showed how difficult it may be to put yourself in the shoes of two people. A Cuban artist created a shoe for two people, and it looked like this. I took a picture of it, the picture in the middle. So you see, it's a very awkward device. You would have a hard time fitting your feet into that shoe for two people, and just as physically you would have a hard time, the mind has a harder time capturing the essence of two people than one, and therefore creating the same kinds of feelings for two than for one. So, so with more people, as the numbers of people increase, attention diminishes as the numbers increase. Images are deficient with large numbers. Feeling collapses when the number becomes large. And then there's another problem, which I'll turn to next, is that the bad feelings about those we can't help demotivate us. But before I finish the psychic numbing, just think about the fact that we are losing lives, not only through genocide, but through extinction. This clipping shows that says species are vanishing quicker than any point in the last 65 million years. And the question is, do we have to wait till the last individual of a species is there before we wake up to the fact that there's a problem here, that we need to act when the numbers are still large, not when the numbers are small. There. So the second problem is this pseudo-inefficacy that I mentioned, and what we've learned is that bad feelings about what we cannot do demotivate us from doing what we can do to help others at risk. It's a false sense of inefficacy called pseudo-inefficacy, and it happens even when the information that conveys bad or negative feelings is completely irrelevant, and this is irrational. And so again, to show how one might study this in an experiment, we gave people the opportunity to donate to an organization called Save the Children on behalf of, children like our little girl on the left, a 7-year-old girl from Mali who's facing starvation. And some people did and some people didn't. And then we had a second study where we thought, well, maybe we could get more people to donate if we impressed upon them that this is a really big problem in the region. So we put the statistical story of how many lives, how many people were at risk in that region of Africa, thinking it would increase the number of people who donated. The amount donated had just the opposite effect. The donations dropped in half when the statistics were presented. And then we said, well, there are millions that, at risk. What if there was only 6 children that you couldn't help? And we found that also we had a group that could help a single child, or a single child, or then that single child when they also knew that there were 6 that they couldn't help. And the concern, the feelings of compassion and the donations dropped. And then we said, well, maybe it's just we're drawing attention away from the child on the left, whose name was Nelson. So we put irrelevant pictures that conveyed negative feelings, like a handgun pointing at you or a snarling dog. And that had the same effect as the children. So we knew it could be completely irrelevant feelings that come in and mingle with the relevant concerns and the good feeling you anticipated when you help a child, and demotivate that. So this is another weird way that our feelings work. The brain lets irrelevant feelings in that mess up the relevant feelings, and we can talk about that. Now, the last component of arithmetic of compassion is beyond the numbing. That it's a more, even when we think slowly and reason, and we have to make a trade-off between conflicting objectives, this can be biased, causing our actions to contradict our values. And this is what we call the prominence effect. And it's another reason we ignore genocides and mass atrocities. It results from a misguided slow thinking when decided between options that require a trade-off between conflicting objectives. That we do one thing, maybe it leads to greater safety or greater protection of people, but on the other hand, it has a higher cost than doing nothing there. And so this is related to limitations of human attention, and we simplify this conflict by focusing attention on only one element of the trade-off. And this happens when we make all kinds of judgments and decisions about risk and other things in our life. So basically, in genocide, strongly held humanitarian values tend to decline or even collapse when decision-making requires a trade-off between protecting these lives and issues of protecting our own security. This can lead us to make choices that can contradict our expressed values. For example, we value human lives greatly, but choose so as to protect our security rather than protect their lives. And this model that we thought we had when we have conflicting objectives, they kind of like weigh them, the pros and the cons, in some compensatory manner is false. It doesn't happen this way. Our attention is focused on one of the elements. In many cases, it's security, and we forget about the lives, and therefore we don't act to protect them. Not because we say they're not important, but because our attention is focused elsewhere. This is like a limitation of attention. A very famous experiment about inattentional blindness is sort of relevant here. It was a study where people saw a group of people passing a basketball around, and they were told to count the number of passes. And then after they did this, they were asked, "Did you see the person in the gorilla suit walking through the group?" And most people didn't see the gorilla because their attention was focused on the other people passing the basketball. That shows how fragile and focused our attention can be, and we often aren't attending to the most important things we should be attending to. And this is also relevant to why we're slow to act on climate change. Our focus, even though we know climate change is important, we're thinking about other things like the price of gasoline or the need to use fossil fuels to get the conveniences that we value so highly. And so we don't make the proper decisions. And I'm going to skip through. I've already gone a little bit over my time. So I can also say that in recent years I've been looking at this security issue in war. And for example, from the American perspective, we certainly assert that the lives of enemy civilians are vital to protect. But scholars of the military contend that Americans appear to be willing to kill foreign civilians on a massive scale whenever such attacks are considered useful to defend critical U.S. national security interests and protect the lives of significant numbers of, say, U.S. military personnel. There was a big expose just this year in the American military where, well, first I should say that historically, scholars like Downs, looking over from 1816 to 2003 about this, concluded that states, including democracies, tend to prize victory in preserving the lives of their own people above humanity in welfare. And it concluded desperation overrides moral inhibition against killing non-competence. Competence, that's again a form of prominence, the prominence of security over other people's lives. And there was a scandal in the U.S. about how the U.S. has been abusing civilians in crises, such as in Syria or in Afghanistan and so forth. And we've ordered there's an investigation to try to change this in the military. And I can also say that this is also very relevant to the potential use of nuclear weapons. Where even though one would say that it is important to use nuclear weapons if a nation's security is threatened, it is likely, as it was for America in World War II and Japan, it's a much greater chance that nuclear weapons will be used. And I don't have time to go into recent research that challenges the ability to make rational decisions about nuclear weapons. For example, with regard to psychic numbing, if we can't appreciate the immense consequences that we can create with nuclear weapons, due to psychic numbing, how can we make a rational a weighing of the benefits, the short-term military benefits of using nuclear weapons against the immense long-term costs if we cannot comprehend the costs? And there's more to this story, but maybe we can discuss that later, or if you're interested, I can refer you to papers. And it's very much relevant to Vladimir Putin, whose security and his prestige is seriously threatened by the poor showing of that his military is having in Ukraine, and would this then threaten him in a way that makes the potential use of nuclear weapons by him greater? It's a question of the day. So basically, that's my story. We're inconsistent and often incoherent in our valuation of human life. We value individual lives greatly, but these lives lose their value when they become part of a larger crisis, and we often, as a result, do too little to protect human lives in the face of threats from violence, natural disasters, and other causes. And understanding the strengths and weaknesses of our feelings and reasoning processes is a necessary first step towards valuing lives humanely and improving decisions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Scott. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to jump in here, and I wonder if my slides can be brought up on the screen. Great. So thank you again to our several hosts, and it's always a pleasure to present together with my father. We spent a lot of time talking about these topics together, and you know, I think our disciplines, mine in the interdisciplinary environmental humanities, and his in psychology and other branches of the social sciences, weave together rather powerfully in relation to these topics. So listening to Paul's presentation about the inconsistencies and sometimes kind of worrisome tendencies of the human mind, it's tempting to say, we have no way out of this predicament. A book that I often teach with by an American author named Roy Scranton is called We're Doomed, Now What? It's a collection of essays on war and climate change. We're doomed, now what? So, you know, hearing about our inability to think coherently about numbers, the bigger the problems are, the less effective we are in contemplating the meaning of those numbers. It would be very easy to say, well, we are indeed doomed, and that may be the case when it comes to matters like climate change, but that doesn't mean that we can't try to push back. And in fact, here in the photo on my opening slide is of leading American writer Terry Tempest Williams, when I accompanied her and her husband to China a few years ago to interact with many of our counterparts in the environmental humanities, including the second lady of China, the wife of the premier with whom Terry is speaking. Her name is Cheng Hong. And Terry is attempting to convey, you know, with her hands reaching out, a certain issue related to the environment, and this idea of trying to communicate effectively, despite the fact that it's difficult to register information, to make information meaningful. This is what I meant to convey with this particular image. So why combine an explanation of the psychological aspects of the arithmetic of compassion, or what I'll call AOC, with a focus on how to communicate this information? And can we use an understanding of the cognitive processes that Paul was just discussing to help us improve our communication efforts when it comes to various forms of humanitarian and environmental crisis? So Paul was laying out a problem, a very worrisome set of mechanisms in the human brain. But I would argue that understanding this psychology helps us to recognize and actually push back against our own insensitivity to information, or against the irrationality of the way we see our own minds working. So having these names, psychic numbing, pseudo-inefficacy, the prominence effect, just having those names and knowing a little bit about them enables us to recognize these tendencies in ourselves and compensate or push back against these tendencies. Also, I would argue that inherent in the psychological understanding of these mechanisms are various communication strategies, such as singularity, the power of the singular example, and the transscalar imaginary, the notion that our own brains might be flexible enough to move from the individual to the many, from the small example to the large scale phenomenon. And in these ideas, psychological ideas, might enable us to better understand information that others are trying to communicate to us, and also how we should share our own information if we wish to have an impact through our expression. And then also, I would say the story of the way Paul and I have attempted to develop our ideas and communicate these ideas related to AOC, combining academic publications and various forms of public outreach, might serve as a model for going public in other disciplines. I assume that many of the people attending this lecture are academics of one kind or another, and you may primarily do your work in a fairly limited communication environment where you're writing to colleagues in the same field. But there may be ways for us to go public, to reach out and use our understanding of our fields as a way of engaging with serious issues in the world. So perhaps we may be doomed, but we may have certain avenues for using this information in order to try to have some positive effect on the state of the world. So many of the ideas from Paul's talk originally appeared in academic articles, but then we attempted to compile them and various other related studies and other kinds of articles in a book that we published in 2015 called Numbers and Nerves: Information, Emotion, and Meaning in a World of Data. We divided this book into 3 sections, the first focusing on the psychological studies relevant to this work, such as what Paul was discussing. The second part focuses on narrative, analytical, and visual strategies for prompting or communicating sensitivity and meaning. So basically, how might certain communication strategies enable us to sidestep or surmount the impairment to sensitivity that Paul presented in his work? And then part 3 consists of several interviews that I conducted with leading communicators on how to convey numerical information to general audiences, non-specialist audiences. And I thought it might be valuable to visit with these people and try to get their advice. What are some of the things that they think about as expert communicators when they're attempting to talk about toxicity or air pollution or other kinds of serious problems in the world? So the term arithmetic of compassion, which is the overarching term that Paul and I use to describe these psychological conundrums that he presented in his work, these inconsistencies and paradoxes, that term actually comes from a 1974 poem by the Polish author Zbigniew Herbert. The title of the specific poem is Mr. Cogito Reads the Newspaper. And in the beginning of the introduction to Numbers and Nerves, we present the poem each line followed by commentary by Paul and by me from our psychological and humanistic perspectives, analyzing the poem and connecting it to the ideas that we attempt to convey in the larger book. Paul's contributions to the book include articles such as one with the title of this lecture, The More Who Die, the Less We Care, on psychic numbing, pseudo-inefficacy, and the prominence effect. And the prominence effect, as he described, is particularly important with situations such as the current war in Ukraine, where a lot of international response is dictated by a conflict between our valuation of human life, our concern for the lives of people who are imperiled, and concern for security. We're often in many ways blocked by intervention because we feel that we would undermine national security if we took certain steps. This is especially the case from the American perspective. It's also very much true of global climate change and the COVID pandemic. Often we espouse certain values. We care about the preservation of a habitable planet, in the future, but we behave in our daily lives as if we didn't care about the climate and we didn't think there was any problem with global climate change. Likewise, we seem to be very concerned about public health, but often we behave in our daily lives as if there is no pandemic, whether in our mask wearing or not wearing behavior. Our gathering with large groups of people may seem irrational because these behaviors are risky during a pandemic, but there are other values and priorities, such as our attraction to social gatherings, that lead us to behave in contradiction to these values. These are often explainable by way of the prominence effect. In the news media and the coverage, for instance, of the war in Ukraine, we see that often journalists have an intuitive understanding of these psychological mechanisms that Paul was discussing. And there's a famous image of this mother who had just given birth around the time of the bombing of the maternity hospital in Mariupol that it's received a lot of attention, this particular image, and it just obviously an effort by the journalists to overcome namelessness and facelessness by giving a face to this humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. And there are many other examples like this, but I just heard that there was a maternity hospital bombed in southern Ukraine today or yesterday, and immediately I thought of this image. So this image from months ago helped to vivify for me and make real something that is happening today, in which many other lives are affected. So the opening section of the Numbers and Nerves also offers an article by Robert J. Lifton, the psychologist who developed the very term psychic numbing. He did it in the context of some research he was doing in Japan following the bombing of Hiroshima in the 1960s, where he said psychic numbing was a survival mechanism, enabling people to withstand the devastating experience of a nuclear attack. And yet he, in a more recent article, The Age of Numbing, he and a colleague named Greg Mitchell said, we now live in an age where we're inundated not necessarily with nuclear bombs, but with information. And this information about crises tends to produce a type of numbing that is not conducive to survival. We are overwhelmed by information. We don't know what to do with it in many cases, and thus we are inactive when we might positively engage with various crises. The second section turns to examples of and explanations about communication strategies by a variety of writers, Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times, Annie Dillard, whom Paul mentioned a few times, Terry Tempest Williams, Bill McKibben. And I wrote an article on yet another mechanism, psychological mechanism, called the asymmetry of trust, which Paul and some of his colleagues have developed. My article focuses on the fact that it's much easier to destroy trust in information than it is to create or cultivate trust. So you have information by authorities about a subject like climate change, and all you need are a few naysayers to try to puncture or deflate that trust. And it's much easier for them to cause that dissipation of trust than it is for all of the authoritative scientists to build a strong sense that we ought to trust the science, or that we ought to trust the journalists who are telling us about some kind of crisis that is occurring. So the asymmetry of trust is a very serious worry that is connected to some of the literary examples that I talk about in the context of climate change. To some degree, we seem to be able to overcome psychological tendencies toward insensitivity and inaction by these approaches, to some degree, by communicating multidimensionally. This is the argument of Edward Tufte, the Yale University sociologist who specializes in writing about communicating quantitative information. And he argues that using many different dimensions, not just one strategy, but combining various strategies, and particularly by highlighting images, narratives, or storytelling, and by personalizing individual faces and stories, we might somehow counteract these tendencies toward insensitivity or toward numbness. And I would argue that also by understanding the psychological processes that are occurring and naming these processes and referring to them explicitly, we can warn our own listeners about what they might be experiencing and help them to counteract these tendencies toward insensitivity. So the elements, the images, narratives, personalizing stories and faces are elements of communication that highlight what psychologists refer to as the singularity effect. By telescoping back and forth, moving in and out between stories of individual cases and explanations of the larger contexts of humanitarian and environmental crises, communicators can work to sidestep the numbing effects of large-scale data and other modes of language, such as technical jargon, which Indian activist whom I interviewed for Numbers and Nerves, Vandana Shiva, calls the anesthesia of destruction. And the use of media that telescope back and forth between the one and the many, such as what Seattle-based photographer and filmmaker Chris Jordan calls the transscalar imaginary, enables us to move more pliably with a kind of psychological pliability that enables us to overcome a kind of compassion fade that Paul describes. However, I would say most of us are tragically incapable of converting any kind of concern that we feel as a result of being moved by effective communication about these crises, humanitarian crises or environmental crises, any kind of moral angst that we feel, we have difficulty converting that to moral action and moving meaningfully between our sense of our small scale ability to act and to have an effect on the large scale problems. So this struggle to move from the feeling of angst to the decision to act remains a serious problem. This is one of the things I discuss with various leading communicators for the third part of the book, Numbers and Nerves, including Mexican environmental and humanitarian activists Homero and Betty Aregis. And they respond specifically to their efforts through various, mostly literary efforts to communicate about air pollution and various other crises in Mexico, particularly in a personal, moral way. How to convey to people that these situations that may be occurring on other continents in vastly different parts of the world have a personal connection to the reader or the viewer so that we might be compelled to engage. Shortly after the Numbers and Nerves book appeared, Paul and I and our colleagues decided to expand the project and connect the ideas of Arithmetic of Compassion more directly to current crises of various kinds in various parts of the world. So we developed a website called arithmeticofcompassion.org. And here you see the cover of the book, Numbers and Nerves, next to the homepage of the Arithmetic of Compassion website. The website includes overviews of the key psychological concepts that Paul was discussing related to human sensitivity and insensitivity to information, and also key relevant concepts from my field, the environmental humanities. Also happens to be the field of our moderator for today's lecture, Professor Małecki. One of these key concepts from the environmental humanities is from Princeton professor Rob Nixon's book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, where he says that slow violence is a way of understanding the difficulty of representing destructive phenomena that occur slowly, out of sight, and in a non-spectacular way, such as climate change, extinction, and also even other phenomena such as the spread of disease, which is relevant to our pandemic context. We can't see these things happening as we walk down the street, and thus they occur in a way that's difficult to apprehend. And it's incumbent on certain types of of communicators, which Nixon calls writer activists, to find ways to use their voices in order to compel attention and enable us to perceive and grasp these phenomena. The blog section of the website, arithmeticofcompassion.org, is regularly updated and now has more than 100 essays, interviews, and reviews highlighting the relevance of these AOC concepts to both chronic and acute crises. For instance, in the past year, we published a blog entry published anonymously by someone who felt it would not be safe to use a name because of family members based in a war-torn portion of Ethiopia called Tigray. And so we're trying to use the website to provide a forum for people to offer personal testimony about phenomena that they think the public should be more aware of. The title of this piece is Tigray, Testimony from Afar. And one of the focuses of this is not on being a victim of a crisis, but the pain of secondhand trauma, as we call it, concern about family members who are back in Ethiopia or in Tigray and likely susceptible to various types of harsh treatment in that military conflict. So in this particular blog, we have not only the statement by the author, but we offer a small essay at the beginning explaining the use of personal testimony, which is conscious of the singularity effect and the way of telling a poignant story by emphasizing the individual experience of the author in feeling concern about family members back in this war-torn part of the world. We have many other examples of testimony, many of them related to genocide of various kinds. Also one related to the pandemic here, an intensive care unit nurse's perspective on COVID-19, and a political activist, Anna Albath from Minority Rights Group, has a piece of testimony about the refugee crisis on the Polish border. I think particularly the border between Poland and Belarus, and the predicament of refugees who are stranded in a kind of no man's land between these two national borders. But she presents this as a form of personal testimony using an awareness of the arithmetic of compassion as a way of telling that story. I've also done some interviews with expert communicators in the blog section. For instance, an interview with Sharman Apt Russell on childhood malnutrition, in which I ask her directly certain questions about communication strategies. Here, for instance, are Sharman Russell's comments on the use of stories in her book on childhood malnutrition. And she talks about her great understanding, her direct conscious awareness of storytelling as a way of taking a larger sociological, economic, and biological problem of malnutrition and trying to present it to her general audience by way of stories about scientists and stories about the people living in parts of the world, such as Malawi, where she's particularly lived at various times in her life, who are prone to childhood malnutrition. Last spring, I worked with the Canadian doctoral student in anthropology, Amy Donovan, to do a written interview on a very different type of crisis, which is the crisis of whales who are victimized by oil prospecting in the northern oceans. And she wrote a fascinating essay called Raw, Dense, and Loud, which is a whale's perspective on cold water energy prospecting. And I found her article so fascinating and impressive that I arranged to do an interview with her on how she experiments with language in order to communicate the vulnerability of whales in relation to the field that she studies, which is called trans-species empathy. And so Donovan's article uses multidimensional prose. Think back to Edward Tufte, the notion of multidimensional communication strategies. She uses fictional narrative, neuroscience, cetology or whale science, literary criticism, petroleum engineering, and various other types of voices and discourses in order to draw readers into the experience of whales in the northern seas. And I'm keeping an eye on the clock here and realizing I need to finish up soon so that we can have some time for Q&A. But in the interview with her about her language style, here she says, for instance, I aim in my own writing for a kind of tangible crackle, lively, material, interactive, not pretending to aim for objectivity. I've done my best to avert factual error in terms of whales' physiologies as science currently understands them. But I hope the more important part of my essay is the texture, the rendering tangible of something that is by nature difficult for the human brain, that is trans-species empathy. If you think it's difficult to put your feet into two different types of shoes, as in the Cuban sculpture that Paul presented, imagine what it would be to put your feet into a whale's fins and empathize with the whale's experience of the world. This is what a writer like Amy Donovan is attempting to do in her writing, to make us feel the way the whale might experience the world. So we've also published a short story by an Indian writer attempting to evoke sensitivity to the plight of handicapped children in rural India, yet another type of social crisis in Kerala, her part of the world. These efforts to understand and represent particular forms of vulnerability are what we call in the environmental humanities precarity, or in a non-human context, eco-precarity. And one of the leading scholars in this area of study is Pramod K. Nayar from the University of Hyderabad in India, who's authored a few books lately on Bhopal's ecological Gothic and industrial disasters, and the implications of communicating precarity of the Bhopal tradition of expression. Also writing a little bit about the non-human context in a recent book called Eco-Precarity. And Nayar now has a UNESCO chair in vulnerability studies at the University of Hyderabad. And this notion of conveying and understanding the way we think about precarity has become a very large and widely recognized field of study in the humanities. We also have scholars in the environmental humanities, such as Heather Hauser from the University of Texas, Austin, who, going back to what I said earlier about being overwhelmed by data, too much information, her book focuses on climate information and various strategies by visual artists and writers in order to make data experiential, as she says in one of her chapter titles from the 2020 book, InfoWhelm. And I have various articles, some of them on the Arithmetic of Compassion website, on making toxicity through industrial contamination poignant and meaningful to people by way of poetry, and also the difficulty of writing in a way that is moving to broad audiences. There have been several publications of the world scientists' warnings to humanity about the seriousness of climate change, but I find that these world scientists' warnings are often written in ways that are heart squashing. They're dull. They don't present a sense of vivid emotional narrative energy that would draw us into these subjects and make us care about them, give us a kind of human meaning. And so I wrote a study of the world scientists' warnings to humanity, criticizing that language and suggesting some alternatives. One of the fields in which Wojciech Małecki, our moderator, and I are attempting to offer some new contributions is the field of empirical eco-criticism, the empirical study of environmental texts in order to understand how they affect audiences' ways of thinking. The broader field might be called empirical cognitive narratology. And so much of what I've been describing here about the way we might communicate in order to overcome limitations in audiences' sensitivity to certain subjects, we're just beginning to understand by doing empirical studies of the way audiences react to different types of language. And so this notion of empirical cognitive narratology is a rapidly growing field that will help us to refine our appreciation of the effectiveness of various communication strategies. I try to use these ideas based on what I know now in teaching testimony writing at various universities and sometimes outside of universities around the world. Here, I'm teaching testimony writing and other forms of environmental writing to a group of graduate students at a university in Malaysia. This is a Nigerian student who's just written testimony about desertification, the expanding Sahara Desert in his home region of northern Nigeria. I also incorporate this into the classes I teach on environmental writing, where a final project requires students to write personal testimony that they might present at a public meeting of some kind. And here the students are reading their testimonies to the rest of the class, and they also are required to write 2 letters of testifying about their concerns through their personal experience. Which are written, these letters are written to corporate, government, or university officials. So I ask the students not just to think about some of these ideas abstractly, but to practice certain types of expression that they might use in their lives as engaged citizens in order to actually act in response to issues that they find worrisome. And I also attempt to practice what I preach, writing various types of op-eds, sometimes with Paul for a variety of publications. And when asked, I'll show up at a public meeting, a public event, such as this climate change march in Idaho, and stand up and give a talk, attempting to weave some of my understanding of these psychological mechanisms into my own presentation on various topics. So this is my last slide. The overarching goal of the Numbers and Nerves and Arithmetic of Compassion projects is to help people become aware of the psychological and communication aspects of information processing in the context of humanitarian and environmental crises. So I've attempted to offer a brief overview of the history and content of these projects here. And at this point, I think we can begin our Q&A session for as long as we have. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Scott and Paul, for your very rich and fascinating talk. We do have some 20 minutes, more or less, for questions, and there indeed are questions. And we begin with a question from Kate Novak, which is, what role do you think journalists and public intellectuals should play in conveying the sense of urgency and emotional impact of mass-scale catastrophic events, since emotional journalism is often equated with manipulative gutter press journalism, and emotions are not seen as a valuable facet of public critique?
You're muted.
Good. That's an important question. Thank you. Thank you for that. You can't avoid having some form of emotion in communication. It's always there, or it's absent. I mean, the emotions are part of the meaning of information, and the problem is that we lack an understanding, an appreciation of the large scale crises that are so devastating to the world. And if we convey it in a dry, unemotional way, it will lack meaning. So I think that, and if you show the face of individuals who are affected, I mean, they are affected. You know, the problem is if you don't show them, they are invisible, and you don't, and they may as well not exist, and the problem may not as well exist out of sight, out of mind. So I think journalists have a responsibility, if their editors permit, to humanize the or for other species to speciesize the reality that they're writing about in large scale.
I would jump in and say that the danger of not humanizing these experiences, and even when we're talking about other species, we need to humanize them in order to make their experience of the other species experience of the world salient for human audiences. We're attempting to write from a human perspective in order to make our own audiences attend to these subjects and you know, have some kind of empathy for these other phenomena. My complaint about the world scientists' warning to humanity is that these warnings are extremely dry. They're short, but they're filled with jargon and with data, and they don't move the audience at all. So I think the scientists were worried about risking or undermining their own authority by stooping to the level of emotion, because they had exactly the fear that this question raises, that somehow they would be undermining their seriousness as scientists if they wrote emotionally on these subjects. And yet I think the importance of conveying poignancy overrides the need to maintain a kind of detachment and formal authority. And I would say also by working multidimensionally, by offering the broader context and the more sort of sober analytical representation of the phenomenon, and then moving into another mode, another dimension, where they write in this more emotional vein. I think there's a way of avoiding the sense that one is merely gushing emotionally about a subject and is not thinking analytically. We can combine both perspectives or multiple perspectives in a single piece of communication.
Let me just add briefly to that. We're talking about making information experiential rather than purely analytic and technical. So, for example, when the scientists make a projection of so many centimeters of sea level rise over a period of time, that means very little to us. But if you could show what that means for what a part of the coastline that we're familiar with and we're connected with will look like with that level of sea level rise, that creates an experiential knowledge that is more meaningful and can be very powerful.
Thank you so much. Here's another question from Anna Heino. Does proximity to the event also impact the reaction to a disastrous event? The closer you are, the more affected you are emotionally.
Absolutely. Again, the part of our brain that responds to individuals. I mean, this was evolved, you know, when we lived in caves, and we only experienced people up close and personal because we didn't have the global scale, you know, ability to communicate that we have now, and so forth. So we survived by being very sensitive to what was happening right in front of our eyes, but in today's world, we also have to appreciate and react and deal with things that are at a distance. But that's where we have to kind of overcome the tendency of our brain to prefer things that are close than distant, and think more carefully, more slowly about the reality of things that are happening at a distance.
In the environmental context, I would say that we've developed the technologies to create vast, faraway crises that are relevant to our own ability to survive on this planet. And yet our psychological capacities have evolved much more slowly than our technologies. So as Paul is saying here, we have this minds that are very similar to those of our ancestors, who really only needed to respond to proximate or nearby threats. And yet, because of technology, and even because of communication technology that brings information to us about humanitarian situations in distant parts of the world, we have that information, and yet we don't quite have the minds that we need, the mental capacities that enable us necessarily to respond with appropriate sensitivity to these very serious crises. This is what Nixon is writing about in Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, that these phenomena that we really ought to be attending to, such as climate change and extinction, are occurring far away and on a scale and at a pace, at a speed that we can scarcely apprehend with our sensory abilities and our mental abilities. Thus, we need artificially, through language, to intensify our focus on these phenomena. And this is the role of communicators, writer activists, journalists, and scholar activists, I would say, to help us pay attention to what we need to be attending to.
Okay, thank you so much. The next question is from Dorota Kochanowicz, and it is, when we speak of big numbers, isn't the psychic numbing also an effect of the social expectation that situations on a large scale must be dealt by states and institutions?
Well, this, to a certain extent, this is something that needs to be dealt with at the larger level, but the individual has a role as well, both in supporting, showing support for the leadership of our states and institutions, and also by actions that if enough people are doing these things, will scale up and make a difference. So people need to appreciate the fact that just because they can't do everything themselves doesn't mean that they're not effective. And one of the ways of being effective is to support organizations and institutions that are actually effective through the power of numbers and the fact that they can gather funding, and they work together as an organization to create change, often at the level of the governments. And so you can support those organizations by donating to them, by becoming a member, by participating in events that they put on where they need participation. There are many ways that you can amplify your own individual effectiveness through working with groups and organizations. So that is one way that you can overcome the numbing and the false sense of an efficacy.
And very, very quickly, let me just say that I at the end of my talk, I rapidly moved through some slides related to offering personal testimony and writing letters. With my students in writing classes, I often will ask them to write some letters, practice writing letters on issues that they're concerned about to different audiences, because you change your voice depending on which audience you're approaching. My thinking is that one of the ways, especially in representative democracies, that we can amplify our own impact, our own power, is by writing letters to officials, from corporate officials to government officials, even university officials, especially for students, and understanding that using some of these concepts in expressing ourselves through letter writing might be a way of achieving this impact that we fear that we can't have if we just act as individuals. And I think even in societies which aren't exactly representative democracies, such as China, there are ways for people to communicate with local or regional government officials and say, these are things that I'm concerned about, often writing in a more, not in adversarial way, but sometimes in a patriotic way. We have such a wonderful city. Wouldn't it be a great thing if we didn't cut down all of the trees next to the streets? There's a way of calibrating your voice and writing about your own personal experience that will be moving to government officials so that they might pay attention to issues that you yourself find important. The book Numbers and Nerves, by the way, is about to appear in Chinese translation. So it'll be interesting to see how some of these ideas have an effect or don't have an effect with that kind of audience.
Thank you. Congratulations on the Chinese edition of the book. We only have time for 2 more questions, and the next one is from Katarzyna Majkowska, and it's pseudo inefficacy experiment. What are the statistics? Because I would for sure find the big number statistics leaflet calling for help more persuasive rationally, and the child more persuasive emotionally, but both persuasive enough. Are there many of such respondents?
I don't know the distribution of people who are more thoughtful, as you obviously are, and those who just react with their feelings. I would have to go dig deeply into the data to try to answer that. But one of the problems with the way our minds work, as I all too briefly tried to express, was that our brain lets negative information that's kind of dampens our enthusiasm. It lets it in, even if it's irrelevant. So the bad feelings from those irrelevant pictures come in and reduce the good feeling that you have about doing something good for someone. This is a vestige of when we lived in caves, where if you heard something, you got information from a sound in the bush or something that sounded threatening, you didn't stop to debate what it was. You just took it as it was and got out of there fast, and hopefully survived to evolve continually. So the brain has no gatekeeper for feelings. If I give you an argument why you should help someone or something, you may think of a counter argument. Well, can I be sure that this will make any difference, and it'll be delivered effectively, and so forth. If information conveys a feeling, an emotion, the brain doesn't critique it. It lets it in just in case you need it to survive. And so and that's very effective in some cases, but it also messes us up. So we have to be aware of that and recognize that we should not be demotivated from doing what we can do just because we can't do everything.
Thanks so much. And we only have time for one more question, and it is again from Kate Novak, and it is for Professor Scotta Slovica. Are there any dangers to the technique that Amy Donovan is using? I'm thinking that it might promote anthropocentric understanding of the world.
Yeah, I think my perspective is that there's no way we can avoid anthropocentric understanding of the world. That even when we try to be biocentric or geocentric, as some people put it, our very desire to avoid anthropocentrism comes from an anthropocentric perspective. So I think there's no way to avoid some degree of anthropocentrism, but we can achieve at least a limited, tempered version of anthropocentrism. There's extreme anthropocentrism, and there's more moderated, or what I would call limited anthropocentrism. I think that's what Donovan is doing, and she's very self-conscious of her techniques. Each of the different sections of her essay experiments, kind of probes a different angle of perspective, which suggests that she's testing the effectiveness of these various techniques individually and in tandem with each other, in order to suggest that we need to make an effort to try to speculate about the experience of another species. I don't think she presumes to know with any degree of certainty, what a whale might be experiencing when there's tremendous pounding and other kinds of noises and wires and other mechanisms in the ocean as a result of oil prospecting. So she's speculating about what this experience might mean to whales. So I agree that there is a strong element of anthropocentrism in Donovan's approach, but remember, she's writing for human readers, and she's attempting to translate what a whale may be experiencing into a format that her human readers will be able to digest and apprehend. And I find her work to be compelling and to have potential in that way. But I certainly don't think she's avoiding anthropocentrism in any kind of absolute way.
Okay, so just as a follow-up, since that question concerned aesthetic techniques, so there's one question from Marta Rusnak, and it is: commemorating the sites of catastrophes or mass murders, experts must face the task of showing scale, but also individual experience. Are museums an effective medium of social communication in the 21st century?
Having participated in an extensive effort by a museum to create exhibits that help people understand risk, people of all ages, appeal to people of all ages. I can attest to the fact that if it's done carefully, that museums can be very effective ways of educating people about rather complex topics and making things experiential. They can create displays where it puts you in a situation that is very educational and things like that. So absolutely, they have an important role to play, as do schools. We need also to think about teaching young children from an early age to think about risk and about relating to other people at a distance and at large scale. As well. That's a whole other effort that maybe a topic for another day. So very good question. Thank you.
And I would say that the cover of this book is from such a display. These are 888,216 red ceramic poppies in the moat near the Tower of London in the UK, commemorating Commonwealth soldiers who were killed in World War I. So this is an example of not a museum exactly, but a type of public demonstration that attempts to raise awareness of the implications of all the casualties of World War I. And this photo was taken by Kenneth Helfand, a landscape architect who has an article in the book Numbers and Nerves, focusing actually on museums, such as Holocaust museums and other public displays of information about mass atrocities. So he attempts to give examples and explain how these displays function as a way of raising public awareness of these events.
Okay, and just really final question. It's a short one, and it's to Paul. From Alik Ismail Zadeh, and it's, did you perform such sociological surveys within the groups of people who donated to one instead of more to learn the reasons of doing so?
Yes. We know a lot about individual characteristics that make people more or less willing to donate to others. And so I think there needs to be more work like this, but certainly within our samples, we try to identify these kinds of individual difference characteristics. So there is information about that, but we need to learn more about which people donate and how to motivate people.
Thank you so much, Paul and Scott, for these answers. And for the lecture, I'm going to pass it over to Dorota, who will say a few final words. Thank you so much.
Myself. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Paul Slovic and Professor Scott Slovic, for a wonderful talk, illuminating and challenging and fascinating. and for very many reasons. So it will take me at least an hour to tell you why it's so. But very briefly, if I may, my own little comment, I think it's fascinating, challenging, because it moves like on a spectrum from the disturbing when you bring the quantitative material, right? And especially around those clusters of pseudo-efficacy, psychic numbing, and prominence and diffusion, prominence, effect and diffusion. And it moves on to the hopeful with more, I think, also Paul's presentation, Scott's presentation on how understanding the cognitive and affective processes that we are going through behind these situations is crucial to promote action, involvement, and, well, first and foremost, I guess, compassion, right? And we all remember, I think, the Polish audience, right? Perhaps the famous entry from Witold Gombrowicz's diary, 5761, I guess, is the section, when he was sunbathing and he noticed there was a beetle lying behind and on its back. So he just flipped the beetle, right, to help the insect to live. Then he helped another because there was another. And then he looked around and there were many more. So he was trying to flip the beetles back on their backs. And then he noticed it was a huge space of dying beetles. And I think this is really something about perhaps the situation where we can go from despair, because he was despaired, to numbing in the end if the situation repeats and becomes normal to this little, let's say, echo sphere. Okay, so thank you again for your wonderful talk, and I hope this is the first time but not the last time that we meet. I'd also like to thank Wojciech for bringing you to our attention to Wrocław and to moderating this meeting. I cannot say how grateful I am to Katarzyna Majkowska, the Akademia Europaea Knowledge Hub manager in Wrocław, because she actually made this event real with her effort. And my great thanks to the technical team, the Zoom wizards behind the scenes, who are also making this event possible, and to our wonderful audience as well, who listened and asked questions. I thank before to our partners, so again, joint thanks again to Akademia Europaea Knowledge Hub in Wrocław, to the University of Wrocław, to the Wrocław University of Science and Technology. It's a long name. Thank you all for a wonderful evening, thought-provoking, very informative, and as I said, challenging in a very positive way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you.